Well, welcome everyone to Building AEC Business Virtually. Where are we now? Welcome to today's webinar with SagePresence. Today's webinar is going to be moderated by myself, Troy Parkinson, and our speakers and presenters today are Dean Lincoln Hires and Pete Makalak, the co-founders and principals of SagePresence. A couple quick housekeeping notes. Today we are going to be doing Q&A, so if you have questions throughout the experience, please feel free to put your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A section. We'll also be doing a few polls throughout the process, and those should pop up into your window as well. Feel free to answer those, and we'll leave those up and engage the group as we're proceeding forward. Quick high-level agenda for today's webinar. Our first beat, we're going to be talking a little bit about the recap of the last few months. We'll then speak about the state of virtual interviews, the state of business development, networking then, now, and in the future. We'll take time for Q&A at the end, but of course, if you have questions throughout, feel free to include that throughout the experience. And then ultimately, we'll share how we can help you and your teams during this time and moving forward in this world. So without further ado, let's begin our conversation. Welcome, Dean and Pete.
Hey, how's it going, gang?
Howdy, howdy.
So right off the bat, I want to take a moment to jump right in and talk a little bit about where we've been and how far we've come in the last couple of months. I would love to get each of your takes on it. And Dean, maybe start with you, knowing that we started this stay-at-home process back in March here in Minnesota and then, of course, across the land as well. Share with us your perspective on where we've been and what these last 2 months have been for the architect, engineer, construction industries as you've seen it.
Well, first off, I would have said it was 3 months. It seems like life has gone a longer distance than just 8 weeks. I guess the high level is kind of the first phase for everyone was the big shock. They get in and they don't know what to do. And so everyone stopped doing everything. And people were asking questions like, what's the point of doing anything? We don't know where we are. So there was this grinding to a halt feeling, quickly followed by, oh my gosh, we better figure this out. And sort of the panic of trying to get used to virtual interviewing. Seems like business development stopped. Seems like nobody knew if you bother your clients. Nobody was interested in learning and development. But we started frantically trying to acclimate and adapt and get comfortable with the new normal. So that's sort of the first couple of weeks. Phase 2 was people kind of accepting and the discomfort and moving forward anyway. And I think in that phase, people seemed a little bit unnerved, uncertain, unconfident, but they started doing the process. And we're kind of in a phase 3, it feels, where people are getting used to this. They don't necessarily like it. It's still got lots of things we're figuring out. We're still on the learning curve. But hey, we're acclimated a little more. This is something we're adjusting to. And I can feel another phase coming where we're going to start to integrate what we left behind back in, but we're going to keep what we have now, and it's going to be some sort of a hybrid. So I don't know. I think this transition is not over, and I'd leave my quick comment on this point. I think it's about to get one more level more complicated as opposed to simpler. And as we ease back, we're suddenly going to have this and have that. And then suddenly the awkwardness of knowing what the next phase of normal is going to be. And there will probably be one after that.
Yeah, yeah. From my perspective, it really seems to be driven by the level of uncertainty that has been out there since day one. I mean, when things started, people really didn't know how much danger are we in exactly. What should and shouldn't we be doing? What should and should other people be doing? And then when building projects got deemed essential, there was that was some degree of assurance for some people. It's like, oh, okay, so some activity can happen. And at that point, owners started doing things like scheduling interviews, or no longer pushing their interviews back. Projects actually, enough confidence entered people's minds that they were like, yes, we can talk about this project like it still exists. We are still doing work to roll things into reality. And the more experience that we've all had with this, the more it's starting to feel like a normal thing, even though this situation is changing every day.
Now, Pete, I'm curious, are you sensing, there certainly was people reported to us a sense that some projects were going to suddenly accelerate. They're going to try to cram interviews, afraid that there would be a collapse. Let's get this project through while we still can. And suddenly we got hit. We went to a standstill in terms of our interview prep coaching. It ground to a halt, and then suddenly it picked up kind of extra fast because people were trying to squeak things in before they went away. And my question for you, Pete, is curious if you've got a read on this. It seems like people are starting to accept that work is just going to continue being there, as opposed to we've got to desperately get it. I think people are starting to say, oh, projects are still going to happen. Do you have any sense in that?
I'd love to say that was true. I don't. I'm not confident about that. I think there are lots of firms out there that are really hugely uncertain about things. It seemed like there were several. I totally agree with you. There were several that were saying, "Boy, if we can just get some commitment from an owner right now, if we can get in on a project right now that could carry us through this whole uncertainty, and basically get us to the other side." Because we don't know if there are going to be any other opportunities after this one.
Yeah, this might be a great opportunity for us to put our first poll out there to the audience. What we'd like to know from you is, how has the last 2 months been for your firm? Have you been able to adapt? Is it worse than you expect? I'm going to launch the poll now. You'll see the questions there. Feel free to, depending on how you're watching, if you have multiple screens, be aware that this pop-up menu may have occurred in another window. But as the responses are coming in, we got a variety here, but ultimately, again, how have the last 2 months been for your firm? The question was: worse than you expected, about what you expected, better than you expected, or you didn't know what to expect. And so we'll leave this open up for about another 30 seconds. We'll let this play in the background a little bit before we get our answer. But ultimately, I would love to get both from Pete and Dean your take on, and maybe sort of a shift into these virtual interviews. What have you been noticing, and how has the interview process changed in the virtual environment? We'll start with you, Dean.
Wow. It's sort of about to change again, so I'm hesitant about what answer to give. I think that people have done a lot like what we said initially in our first webinar 8 or 7 weeks ago, when we said stick to classic. And then all the reinforcement is right now, they just want to meet the people and hear what you have to say and get to the basics before you go crazy. The big shift that I'm seeing is this next phase starting. We're starting to have live interviews hybridized with virtual. So the hybrid interview is starting as people are going back. What I expected is this would get easier. It'd be more like when we would do an interview and there'd be a screen with somebody from another state. It did not get easier. It got way more complicated. So I'm like, this was so not what I was anticipating. So social distancing is becoming an element in the live interview, which is really confounding the process. So let's just say you had 3 interviewers and they had to be 6 feet apart. Suddenly it's a strange thing to look at. Like, they used to stand together, now they're way apart. What if you have 5 people in an interview, 6 feet between? What if you have 8 people or 10 people? And some interviews get that big, and suddenly you've got, imagine the wall that you'd need just to have that. Then all the complications of the virtual interview compound inside of that space. What are we seeing? Is there going to be a big screen that shows the remote people? And how does it bounce back and forth between the live people who are now small and farther away and the big screen people? The whole question is is a complete quagmire. And how do you do sound? And if you're going to use sound cues from people who are far apart, maybe we mic them. If we mic them, is it going to be switching? Are we linking all the mics to their picture? So the producing challenge of this is double the complication of the annual fundraiser. So you go to the hospital and they do the annual fundraiser, and they got a podium and they blow the video up on 2 big screens so that if you're far away, you can see the people. We've got our people all scattered around the room, the audience separated. It's just like a whole new quagmire of things to figure out. So that's my, I can't wait to just do a virtual interview. That's just so simple now.
Yeah. And before you jump in, Pete, let me just do a quick recap here. We'll end our poll here. For those of you who chimed in, thank you. So the results are in. Ultimately, for most people, about 42% of the people we polled, they felt it was about what they expected. What the last 2 months at your firm has been about what they expected. The second to that was 27%. They didn't know what to expect. And that's obviously fair as well. This is all new territory for all of us. So this is definitely something that we want to keep in mind as we continue our conversation. But let's make that shift now into that virtual interview space. And Pete, I'd love to hear from you. In the last 6 to 8 weeks, what have you discovered when you've been working with teams? What are the key things that people need to be thinking about if they've done a virtual interview or if they're preparing for one?
It really feels like there has been an evolution over the course of the last 8 weeks. I mean, when we started this, I think there was a tremendous concern that this was a venue that people didn't have their brains wrapped around. And I think a big complicating factor is we're doing this from our homes here. So the larger, more resourceful organizations have had Zoom or something like it for a long time, but just haven't needed to use it for interviews. Now they need to use it, and they need to do it from home. So there's this big question of, how do we show up professional when we're doing this from home? And, how do we not embarrass ourselves?
Pete, what about the people that should be asking that question that aren't? We're still on a weekly basis. I'm still seeing a camera view in maybe not an interview, but a business meeting. And I'm seeing closet doors, clothes, kittywampus, hangers, and I'm like, wow, are you not aware of this question?
Well, so I think there has been this really interesting evolution in that when we started, there was kind of a nice, reassuring concept that we were all in the same place with everybody. We're all thrown off balance by this. None of us really know how to do this. And so, owners are in the same awkward place together with prospects in an interview, and that can kind of generate some nice connections right there. Oh, you feel uncomfortable with this too? Yep, so do we. That's nice. And what I think is happening is people are figuring it out relatively quickly, and it is starting to become a competitive advantage to really get this stuff and to really be able to present yourself professionally, even though you are presenting from home, and even though your environment might not be ideal. But if you can make it professional, it's a nice way to stand out.
Well, I will say too, I'll add to this, in some of the conversations that I've had as well with clients over the last few weeks, one of the interesting things that we've heard is that people thought they could show up and do their interview just the same on this environment, that in many ways they practice just as equally as they do for a live interview, or they thought, oh, well, we'll just transition from the live to the virtual. And then they discover a lot of the technical elements. So, for those folks on this call here today who maybe weren't on our first webinar, Dean and Pete, can you each give us, say, 2 key points on how to make your virtual interview successful, or things that you should be thinking about? And while you're covering those points, I'm going to launch the next poll for our group. And I'd love to get a sense from the group, how you rate your interview teams, or I should say, rate how your interview teams have been doing on virtual interviews during this time. So I'm going to launch that poll now. And then, Dean, why don't you share 2 key points that people should be thinking about for their virtual interviews?
Or Dean, you do one, I'll do one.
Okay, yeah, I've got one on my mind, and it's a little bit of a deep concept, and it's less of like a tip. It's that most of us grew up in the working world that actually let you build your professional role separately from anything else. And my understanding of building a professional role was to sort of strip me out of it and put forth the things that made me look successful as a role. I wanted people to know me in light of my role. Now then, I would build my relationships in the lobby just after the meeting. In the little downtimes, so there was a clear separation between Dean hires as a business role and Dean hires as a person outside of work. Those 2 worlds just collided together and sort of became one. And I think that the closest I'm going to get to a tip for you, Troy, is I think we should be paying more attention to intentionally managing the combination of our personal brand and our professional brand, because they now kind of happen together. And wow, you get a glimpse into my world. And so I've got to think, what part of my world do I want to let you glimpse into? So I don't have yet a tip, but the tip is to recognize the new challenge that wasn't there before. I have to be, my personal brand is spilling into my professional brand at a very different level. So be intentional about the process of thinking that through. What do I want to show up so that I can still be professional and the personal side is somewhat inescapable?
How about you, Pete?
Well, I want to respond to how you got into this topic. So you said that a whole lot of people were approaching this concept of virtual interviews exactly the same way as they approached their live ones. And live doesn't seem like the right word to use because they're all live, right? But they're in-person ones. So the good thing about that is there's definitely something appropriate about that. The way we have always seen it, interviews always have to boil down to, in a way, it's a chemistry experiment. It's how do your personalities combine with the personalities of the owners. And it's a good instinct to say, you know, I just need to be me, or we just need to be us as we interview. The thing to bear in mind is different scenarios can get in the way of that, or it can have you show up differently. So if you feel like, you know what, presenting myself to a camera is going to be exactly the same as presenting myself to a bunch of decision makers when we're all in the same room together, I think you're probably gonna discover that isn't true, and you can really throw yourself off balance by discovering that in the moment, that, oh my gosh, wow, talking to a little circle on my computer really isn't the same as talking to a bunch of decision makers in the room and actually being able to make eye contact with them and actually being able to see how they respond to me in the moment. So yeah, the best thing you can do in advance is recognize the difference and know how to present yourself differently given that different scenario. And
some of those key, just technical dynamics worth keeping in mind for everyone who's listening and maybe didn't see our first webinar on confident presence for virtual interviews, is simple things like this: being aware of what's in your frame, you know, being aware of what's behind you, trying to have your camera in the position of your mouth so that when you're speaking to it, you're still maintaining eye contact, coming forward with appreciation. You know, there are a number of tips that can actually make the presentation aspect of you communicating very natural and making that connection. But you can dive deeper into that in some of our other webinars. I want to keep moving forward. I want to do a quick touch here on the end of our poll here. Any other final people that want to take our poll and just checking in on rate how your interview teams have been doing? Coming in right now, you know, about 36% of the folks on this phone or on this webinar today are actually haven't had a virtual interview yet. So the reality is that things have been being pushed back, maybe being rescheduled, or they're trying to hold out until they can be in person again. But I'm going to end this poll here. I'm going to share the results with everyone so you can kind of get a sense of what's happening. I want to roll back into a conversation that we had a couple weeks back with a selection panel and a group of owners. And Dean, I'd love for you to talk about what you learned and what people should know about what selection panel members are thinking in these virtual interviews.
Well, I'll try to stick to the ones that I think will really make a difference in the success of the interview. And the number one thing to focus on is the ability to tag team. So the three of us right now are working very hard to pay attention to what the other people are doing so that we're not stepping over each other too much and that we show interest in each other and our point of view. So our tag team as we go might even speed up, but that's the thing to practice. So selection committees say, we are looking to see the synergy inside of your team. We want to see if you like working with each other. Do you respect each other? Can you anticipate each other? And this is the worst environment ever to do that. So that's actually a total opportunity. So practice that, because that's what the selection committees are telling us that they're really looking for. And in an environment where it's a little scarce because of the format keeps it out, and it means it's the opportunity to work towards showing it. That would probably be the first one. I've got several others, but what are you hearing, Pete?
Well, kind of a neat surprise that I've heard is that selection committees actually enjoy a certain kind of personal experience in an interview. So, you know, in the middle of an interview, your dog barks, or your dog runs up to you, or you know, some little hint about what your personal life is. I've heard selection committee members say, you know, actually, we really like that. We just like to get a sense of you as a human being. So I think that is a cool insight. And as I think about it, I think it's one of those things that you kind of have to be intentional about. You can't just let it all hang out, right? I mean, I'm sure when selection committee members say that, they're not like, yeah, you know, we want to see your dirty laundry. We want to see every aspect of your home life, because we really want to get behind the curtain with you. I think that's there's a fine distinction between what totally ingratiates you with the selection committee and what kind of throws things off. So
if I could hop in, one of the things I think is behind that, why it works when it works, because I've seen it work and not work. I was on one and suddenly a little kid comes in the background, goes, grabbed a sandwich and went on, and everybody thought it was cute, you know?
Yeah.
And of course that wasn't planned. The thing I think that happens is anything that lets us see who you really are is a sign of the fact that people want to know who you are and they want to get behind the authentic you. And some of those little moments trick it out of us. So what happens is we drop our professional barriers, our false front, and a little bit of reality pops in. And if that works and goes fluidly, it's good. Just like the interview where I've mentioned several times, the client loved the prospect loved the interview team because everything went wrong and they handled it so well. So it's the humanity, not the stunt, you know, but these little moments become a sign of your humanity, and that brings us in. Seeing your real house sometimes brings it in. As you can see, audience, we're toying around here. We're in house. Pete's got a company background. We're trying different things to find out what works. But I think the principle that these little oddities of where our real life spills in. It's that they get a sense of authenticity from you. They wanted that in the old kind of interviews. They're going to want it in the new kind of interviews. And interestingly, this venue brings a piece of that sometimes.
And one of the other things that have been a common question for us throughout these last couple of weeks is, how should our team look together? What's the synergy of them coming together? And our recommendation is very much be aware of how you're all showing up on the screen. As you can see here for Dean, Pete, and I, we're all showing up very similar, head and shoulders look. In this instance, we're sitting down because we're just having a conversation. We want to create an intimacy in our dialogue. But we recommend for interviews that you stand, that you present yourself. There's an energy that comes through those. And some of those finer details in those minutiae of how to present yourself really can make a world of difference. We've worked with teams before, and I remember this. Day one on the first presentation that we worked through, everybody's camera's different. Some are looking up, some are looking down. Everyone's not in sync. And by the time that we get to that end rehearsal, everyone is in sync. They show up and there's a presence collectively as a team, whether they're wearing, logo shirts or whether there's an image in the background. But regardless of what their background is and what shirt or color they're wearing, they all look like a team and they come together because they have prepared and have presented themselves effectively.
That creates a zone. Sorry, Pete. That creates a zone of vulnerability. Just to be aware, for those that said we haven't had an interview yet, the one disadvantage there is that the other teams are getting more comfortable, and you're going to go, oh, here's our first. Now, the upside is they're effectively Zoom meetings. So be practicing the principles in your Zoom meetings because you're getting used to it there. But I'll close this point with intentionality. So Troy and Pete and I had probably a 6-7 minute conversation about sitting or standing and why. And we were deciding whether to try out this background that Pete has just to see what happens or not. We don't always make the right call, but we're trying to make the call strategically. We want to have a reason to do it, and we want to be intentional and together about it. And all of that not only brings consistency, but it boosts our confidence that at least what we're doing, right or wrong, we're doing it for a reason and it made sense to the group. And so we're talking about these things regularly, and the only time we totally slack off is when we're doing a meeting that's just internal. But we often practice these things in the internal meetings too, just so that we're constantly preparing.
Yeah, and so that's almost exactly what I was gonna say. There have been a bunch of interview teams that I've worked with over the course of the last 8 weeks that kind of seem to be saving it up till final rehearsals. You know, their setup is kind of awkward. They're not in the space that they're going to be speaking from. They're not dressing terribly professionally, and then they kind of get it together on the last day. It seems to me it's a much better idea to get that stuff in place earlier than later, so that you can practice what it feels like to present, or to interview. You can strengthen your muscles as you're practicing this stuff, and so that in the ultimate interview, it's starting to feel like second nature, like it's relatively automatic, instead of, okay, now I got to get it together,
That's a really good point. I don't know if you've seen this, Pete, but in the interviews that I've been coaching, it seems like one of the key indicators, not necessarily to what the outcome of the interview is, because our job is to do a good interview. Their job, the prospect, is to make a decision. So they're connected but separate things. What's been a big indicator to me of whether the interview is going to go well is whether there's somebody, usually and a relatively, the team leader or somebody who's part of orchestrating the prep. If they start modeling the things that we're working on, it takes with the team. And if they don't, if it's just good information, it doesn't take. So there was one interview that we coached where, to my surprise, the interview lead on their team happened to, for a hobby, do voiceovers. He did client voiceover, he did commercials, and he took acting workshops on the side. He said, oh, I don't know, I just have always been interested in that, and so it's something I do. With that interview team, we would teach something, you'd see the light bulb go off in his head, and he modeled it every moment after that, and the team stepped up. So you step up to the beat of who's ever setting that drum beat. So I notice that I can tell when somebody's just, yeah, great information, and then they don't model it. It's going to be hard. Then I'm going to be pushing it all uphill, and it may or may not be taken. So it's one thing to understand, and I've seen pretty much universally when we work with people, I know you two would say the same, they can do it. It's not whether they can do it, it's whether they do it. And somebody chooses to do it in my meeting with you, in my meeting with my client, this one, that one, practice, rehearsal, and they model it, and then it starts pulling in. That's what seems to be my clear decider. I can tell which interviews are going to go well.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to make a shift now from the interview conversation into business development. We've also had some conversations, and Pete, you moderated a panel with BD leaders in the architect, engineer, and construction world. Pete, maybe start us off by explaining a little bit about what you're learning and what you've learned about how business development is happening during this time. And before you answer that, let me launch our next polling question, because I want this out to the group as well. We would love to know, the question is, how much business development have you been doing these last 2 months? I know it's been unique for everyone, but Pete, maybe share what you learned in your panel.
Yeah, and when we say you, by the way, in that question, we're curious to know about like your team. How much business development has your team been doing these last 2 months? And I say that because our perspective consistently around BD has been, when it comes to professional services in general and architectural engineering and construction firms in particular, everybody really could and should be participating in this, not just the people with the words business development in their title. So what have we been experiencing over the course of the last 2 months? Well, I think when this began, when quarantine started, there was just so much uncertainty and so many questions. People really didn't know what to do. And I know that was definitely my experience. There were just massive questions about, are people even working right now? If I call their mobile number, am I going to be interrupting home life? So I think right off the bat, there was a whole lot of uncertainty and hesitation around doing anything that remotely had a whiff of business development or professional anything. Shortly after that, I think that once the freeze melted, people started reaching out to each other just with a, hey, how are you doing in the midst of this? A really nice personal outreach. And some of the bolder people started discovering, hey, these senior level folks who I haven't been able to get a hold of, they're now picking up the phone because they're home, they're stuck, and they're open to personal conversation. So I'm able to have a meaningful connection, a meaningful conversation with senior leaders to a depth that I haven't had before. And a big part of that was just people just seem to have the time. Then it felt like people got super busy. And availability fell, but as people got super busy, that meant that they were focused more on work and more receptive to work conversations. So it was an interesting little battle between sense of bandwidth and sense of time. And that's about where we seem to be right now. I think business development is on people's radar. I think people are open to it in the way that they are in sort of normal circumstances. and here we are in this landscape where even though things are opening up, we aren't physically connecting much yet. There is still this concept of social distancing. There still is a whole lot of inclination towards virtual communication, phone or camera, and now here we are just sort of figuring it out.
Well, it's the perfect time for one of our audience questions. Eileen writes, how do you tell the client to turn on their video so that you can actually see their face? How do you build these dynamics so that you're actually making a human connection versus it just really being a telephone call?
I got a question for what time is this in a business development scenario that this person's probably asking that question?
Yeah, I would actually, what I wanted to, Pete, for you to drive it from a BD standpoint, and Dean, I'd love for you to speak about it from an interview standpoint, what you can expect to ask the selection panelists to do. So Pete, you first as a BD perspective, how do you make sure that they turn on their camera and that you make it a video experience?
Well, I think you do need to kind of explicitly say it in advance, you know. Well, I say that like it's black and white. That would be my general recommendation is reach out to somebody in a phone conversation or an email connection and say, hey, I'd love to do a full-fledged virtual meeting with you with camera, you know, so like explicitly say it. I would love to actually see you, you know.
And Pete, I want to hop in. I agree with you, and it's important. So as somebody, so I'm not as business development as you. I want somebody to tell me when I'm expected to be on camera. Right. So I care a lot about how my brand comes across, and I hate it when I get, oh, this is supposed to be video. So because of all the considerations we're talking about, I don't drop that on somebody.
Right. Yeah. It's pretty hard to just spontaneously do it. You know, it's exactly why camera phone conversations didn't catch on terribly quickly. I mean, I remember when the technology was in existence, people were like, I don't want to have to do my hair, you know, so that I can receive these calls spontaneously. And
when we were kids, Pete and I we didn't grow up together, but we were both science fiction fans. We saw all the Star Trek shows, you know, they got their video. We couldn't wait for that. And then as soon as I thought, oh, I don't like that at all, you know, and I noticed it cramps your ability to multitask. Some things are great on the phone, like driving and making a call. I can make a call and I can fold laundry, or I can do, you know, there's some tasks that don't disrupt that, but they do disrupt this. This is your full attention. And as Troy passed an article around to us, the studies show that this taxes the brain in a different way, because we read cues about body language to know how we're landing, and this takes them, it veils them. So part of our brain that used to run at a 2 is running at a 6, trying to pick up enough signals to know where we stand. So we're asking people to do a mentally taxing activity that makes them feel a little more vulnerable. Even if they don't feel nervous about it, they know that your brand, you know, there's all sorts of things that are affected by it. So I think letting people know is pretty important. I'll throw it back to you, Pete, but we've been hearing, you know, a lot of talk from other business developers about the phase. You know how like you would do a call and at a point you'd go over to their office? There's a time when the human connection is more important than earlier. So it's probably not your first meeting. It's probably a later meeting when it gets to the point where we really want to know each other, that it's just slightly later than the phone call. Think of it as the same phase where you'd want to go over and meet them at their office or have you over to our office. That's when this makes a lot of sense to people.
And I want to add to that, because there was some clarity from the person who asked our question. They're specifically actually referring to the presentation. So many people are on Zoom in an interview, but I can't see the selection panel. I can't see the client. What are your recommendations, Dean, for interview prep when your selection panel won't be seen, or you'll only hear them? Or how do you exude all of those things if you can't see how they're reacting?
This is really tough, and actually, and then another way, maybe not. So one thing to notice, to let everyone off the hook, when you do an interview live, they're pretty stoic. You often, not always, but you often don't get that much body language indication because they're in their poker face mode during the interview. But you still, since you're in the room, you can feel it. The part of our brain that tracks that stuff is better in an in-person live kind of an event. What I would do is I would accept that you can't make them turn it on. What you can do is ask in advance. So it's not interview time. We want to explore. Can we explore with you what the scenario is? Will we get to see you? Sometimes people don't do it for bandwidth reasons. Sometimes they just want you to do all the heavy lifting. So recognize you don't get to make the call. You can't say it has to be this way, but you can ask and ask ahead of the interview. Say, we'd like to be able to see you too. Is that going to be okay? If they say no, then you're stuck with that. We're seeing a higher level of asserted control, not always, but more clients who say, nope, this is the way we're going to, nope, we made our decision. And they're exercising power through controlling the way the venue is going to be. So I'll give you one fail-safe, which is the more in your regular Zoom meetings that you practice weaning yourself from the need to watch the screen so closely, which by the way doesn't look like eye contact anyway, and spend more time with the camera. So what I'm learning to do, and I practice it all the time, is stay with the camera. I'm reading little cues of body language. I don't get a lot, but I get some. And I'm appreciating through the lens. I'm bringing my positive energy as a gift through the lens to you. And I've been weaning myself of the need to watch what you're doing. Is Pete liking? So I look at Pete and I can see he likes what I'm saying. That gives me comfort. Instead, I'm going to abandon that. I'm going to look at the lens and I'm going to give him that. I'm going to give him the vibe, the positiveness, and I'm going to stay connected. And then I'll look down occasionally. And what I'm getting is quicker at looking at the camera lens and back, pulling the information and staying with. Because at the moment, and I'd say this is going to be for sure 6 months, 9 months, a year before we see any technological advances that will change this. The people who can bring the gift of warmth and connection to the lens have an edge of the people who desperately need to ride the images and pull the information. So be there for what you give more than what you get.
All right, so I want to wrap up our first poll from this section, or our poll from this section, excuse me, and that was on business development. And I'm going to end that poll. I'm going to share the results for that so folks can see how much business development have you been doing these last 2 months? And 42% of folks are doing more than before. And we've heard a lot about that from marketing folks within AEC firms as well. But in some ways, business is more so because they're having to put out more messages and more communication during this time. But 33% of the group as well who voted said they're doing less than before. And that's also natural. We're hearing a lot of it's about the touch point. It's important. Mm-hmm. Pete, I want to transition into sort of our next section in our conversation. And that's about, it relates to business development, but it's unique to networking. Recently, you held a networking training for virtual networking. I'd love to hear some of your tips and insights for the audience here on how they can best network in a virtual environment.
So, yeah, this was a pretty darn cool event. I think there were about 60 people involved. And over the course of an hour, we did this very focused little lesson with breakout exercises. And over the course of the session, as people experienced these breakout sessions, they were randomly selected, paired off with one other person. And the impression that I got was that people really enjoyed that process. And I've been in a virtual networking event that was like that too. The person in charge threw out a question and then created these breakout conversations of multiple people. And the thing that I experienced was, wow, it's we get to these conversations faster. There's the awkwardness that is so often present in a in-person networking experience is finding that person who's available and then rolling your way into the conversation, kind of finding your way to start. And it's just not very efficient, not very time effective. In virtual networking conversations, what I've experienced so far is the tools cut through that. And you can get, if you know how to do it, if you know how to have a productive conversation, you can get to the productive conversation, right from the get-go, which I think everybody appreciates.
I got to ask you, so my perception from hearing about this event and how it's different than the ones that we've done live over the years, the technology, you test whether I'm right or wrong. The technology is probably not what's doing the speeding it up, but it was your leadership inside of the event, right? You're putting them together and you're saying go, and it takes away the vulnerability of, oh, I have to interrupt you and find you. It takes the hunt out of it. It allowed you to lead it. So to what degree is it the technology versus the degree that it's led that would make it?
Actually, I think it's about 50-50. That technology that allows you to get paired off with a single person, and there's no distractions, no noise to have to contend with. It's just you and this one other person, and it's starting right now because the technology allowed that. It's considerable, especially now that my hearing is starting to suffer with age. But the other thing, yes, it's really good networking leadership. And the one that I was a participant in, the person in charge did a really good job of saying, okay, in a minute, I'm going to press a button and you're going to be in a room with 4 other people. Here's the question that I think would be good for you guys to discuss. So she gave us the question, and then she flipped a switch, and here we are in this conversation. And, I think partly because of the technology and partly because of the good leadership, and partly because, hey, I'm doing this from home and I only have so much time for this. People didn't want to burn time. They didn't want to futz around and do something else or talk about other stuff. They wanted to actually do what was being asked of them because they knew that would be the most productive use of their time right now. So
and that is one other thing that we've noticed as well in relation to a lot of our partnerships with other organizations within the AEC world. So AIA is an example of, they've done town hall meetings that we've been able to attend, and it really allows you to build, authentic community connections. It gives you that face time in a very uncertain time for all of us, where we recognize we're all going through this together and we're longing for those human connections. Also, organizations like S&PS have provided virtual happy hours, which a lot of organizations are doing. They're taking their monthly meetings into, a virtual event. So the thing I found most beneficial about these opportunities is when you're in a Zoom networking experience, it's probably the first time in my life where I've been blessed to be able to actually have the name of the person on the screen. So often I'll get a card, I'll forget the name, not intentionally, but just by the nature of meeting so many people. But in this instance, I can take the time to really make that connection to the person, write their name down properly, be able to find them later on LinkedIn and make that authentic connection again. And there's an intimacy. It also works for just expanding your business development range. So if you have clients or organizations that you're trying to reach out to build relationships with, see what they're doing. When are they having their monthly networking events or their happy hours? And that's an opportunity to jump in as well. I want to
a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead, Dean.
And I looked at your name several times to make sure I got it right. Should the AEC firms start putting on social networking versions of networking? Should we be putting on our own events? And part of the reason that what that tickled in me is I've been noticing as some of the world's creeping back in, there's a whole lot of kind of social distancing questions when you do find yourself live. Then there's that shaming thing about whether you're wearing a mask or not. There's been a lot of weird tensions around actually going back together. This is another advantage of this format. The social distancing is built in. It's safe, and it's a place where we can drop at least that guard down and just be with people when we're, and I think expect the next 3 months to be a new version of awkward. because a lot of people think differently about it. I meet people and I don't know if I'm dissing them by not shaking their hand. I don't know if I'm insulting them by moving too close to them. I don't know who's afraid to be in the space with somebody else. This is great. So should AEC firms be trying to put on their own events to do that?
You know, my gut reaction to that is I think we're all going to be adapting. I know the design world is learning to adapt and start to design for social distancing, knowing that this may be the way. I know we've been on interviews where there's been conversation beats about social distancing. So I think any opportunity you can to generate community and bring people together is a positive thing. And also recognizing that by the time it gets to 5 o'clock at night, people are probably zoomed out or videoed out. But I think people creating those authentic connections is important. I do want to jump into just sort of a quick recap. I know we're getting almost to the top of our hour here. I want to make sure that everyone who's been watching and connected has any of their questions answered. So we're going to shift into a Q&A here. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box or drop them into the chat box. But while we prepare for some of those questions, I do want to bring up, Dean and Pete, our key recommendations. And, maybe Pete, you can take the first three, and Dean, you can take 4 and 5, and just speak a little bit to what our recommendations are during this time.
Great. Okay. So the first thing is to, first and foremost, I believe, is continue to create a personal connection with people. And that's whether you're interviewing or doing business development. And a big part of this speaks to the thing that Dean was just talking about, because our current circumstances are so charged, that it seems like everything is political right now. And because there are just so many questions and so much uncertainty about what's going on in the minds of other people, it's very easy to imagine that many face-to-face interactions will bring with them a certain degree of awkwardness and uncertainty. If you bring empathy into that mix, and which means a real intention to engage the other person in the way that they want you to, and which means being open to asking, that's a great sort of spine, a central column for creating a personal connection with them. Second thing is prepare for the hybrid virtual interview. So yeah, Dean was talking about this weird hybrid scenario of in one aspect it's live and in person, in another aspect it's virtual. There are going to be more things like that, more instances of that. So just start wrapping your brain about how to make the most of the opportunity, how to start prepping your team for scenarios like that. And then the third one is get your team on board and actively involved in BD. I'm so happy to hear that more of you out there have done more BD than anything else. It's fantastic to me. That says to me that you guys are being really proactive. You're getting your teams involved in this stuff, and you're having them actively work their relationships with existing clients and with the kinds of prospects that you want to have. So well done.
And then prepare for virtual networking conferences. We're starting to move from business development into that place where marketing might spill into business development. We're definitely hearing that marketing people are extremely busy right now. People have been amping up, SagePresence has been amping up its outward marketing. And we want to start looking for more of these virtual conference opportunities, create them, look for them, participate in them. But don't wait. I notice my personal tendency is, oh, I don't want to do it. And the more experience we get in learning to network in this format, the better we're going to be at it. And I'd be intentional about this merger that's happening between your personal brand and your professional brand. They're two things that we used to manage separately, and you'd screen one back. So my professional relationships, I didn't talk too much about work. My work, I tried to keep life off to the side so I could be professional, they're kind of mixed together now. So just be very conscious about those two brands and how to integrate them together.
Excellent, excellent. And one thing to keep in mind for all of you watching as we begin to bring our session here to an end is that our commitment here is to be helpful, to help you and to help your teams succeed successfully in all of their endeavors in the architect, engineer, and construction world. And so if you have questions that come up that you didn't think about in this session and you want to send them to us, please feel free to do so. We also wanted to just take a brief moment here at the end to just let you know how we can help. Obviously, we do a lot of work in virtual interview prep. Dean and Pete have 20 years experience, and SagePresence has 20 years experience helping teams prepare for those high-stake interviews. All of that still exists today, even in this virtual space, and we can help with that. We have virtual interview crash courses, and for those of you who are interested, we can come in and do this with your firms. Come in and work with your team specifically on our 3 virtual interview crash courses. Or if you'd like, you can join us on our public virtual crash courses, which start actually June 2nd. So we'll be doing a course every 2 weeks in our 3-part series. You'll definitely want to check that out if you're looking for some extra tips and extra support on how to help your teams utilize the virtual interview experience. Ultimately, we have virtual business development programs as well. As Pete mentioned, it's so crucial for all of your team to be on board, to be able to articulate and communicate your value proposition for your firm and move forward successfully in that experience. And then just something for the radar, in the future, coming up in September, we're going to be doing a 7-session unique confident presence for high potential team members. So keep an eye out for that, as it provides an opportunity for you to have your team built as well. It is a strange and unique time, and SagePresence wants to be here to assist and support you in everything that you do. Let us know how we can be of service. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation today. Dean and Pete, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insight on what you've learned these last few weeks. Any final words from each of you as we begin to wrap it up?
I can make a short one. I would anticipate and embrace the pending awkwardness of the next few phases. It's not going to go back to normal. It's going to work its way slightly stranger and then to another new normal. So what I do is bring care and appreciation and kindness. Just embrace it and try to be excited and bring a good energy into it and expect some strange phases to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and building off of that, this is something that I mentioned in one of our webinars over the course of the last 2 months. I feel like I can't say it enough. So much about successful interactions has to do with your confidence, and that's really why we call ourselves SagePresence. We're really all about building the Sage confident presence of you and your team members. And I think a lot of the people involved in a lot of the people that we're talking to right now in this audience are already have a fair amount of that for themselves. They have substantial confidence and presence in themselves, and they want more of it in their team. As confident people, whether you are a leader of other people or not, you can be a channel for other people's confidence. So empathizing with people who aren't naturally exuding their confidence, empathizing with them, and being confident for them can kind of open a gateway for them. It's especially if you are in a position of authority. You can be a great welcomer of other people's confidence by enjoying who they are and celebrating who they are instead of focusing on who you want them to be. It's a great way to give them permission to be themselves, which actually does give them a certain access into a kind of confidence that you quite possibly haven't seen in them yet.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dean. Thank you, Pete. And thank you to all the participants who tuned in today. We wish you well in the weeks that lie ahead. Be safe, be healthy, and we look forward to serving you when the time is right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.